"You want me for my body," Clara Weston said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the cold. Caleb Rowan didn't flinch. He was leaning against the corral rail, the wind tugging at the loose ends of his coat, his dark hair pushed back from a sun-browned face. "No," he said, steady and low. "I want you because you don't beg." The words hung there between them, carried in the thin, biting air of Pine Ridge Crossing, Wyoming Territory, late autumn of 1884. Snow was still clinging to the ridge lines from last week's storm. The smell of pine resin and coal smoke drifted down from the town. Clara's hands were raw from work, fingers red at the knuckles, but she kept her arms folded like a shield. A month ago, she'd stepped off a dust-covered wagon on the edge of this small town, her dress torn, her lips split, clutching her 6-year-old boy Eli to her chest. The man who'd promised them safe passage west had turned mean when she said no, and she'd jumped before the wheels had stopped rolling. That first night, she'd stumbled into the livery barn, looking for nothing more than a roof to keep the frost off her boy. Caleb had been there, brushing down a roan mare by lantern light. He hadn't asked what happened. He hadn't told her to move along, just handed her a blanket and pointed her toward a quiet corner. Since then, she'd kept her distance. She worked at dawn, mucking stalls, hauling water, keeping her head down, while Eli played in the straw or sat tracing letters in an old mercantile ledger she'd salvaged. Caleb fed them without asking for coin, no bargains, no ledger of favors. And that, more than anything, made her uneasy. Now, in the thin light of afternoon, she studied him like she was trying to see the catch. Men always wanted something: her hands, her time, her body. Even the ones who claimed they were different. "Most folks who've been through what you have," Caleb said, eyes steady on hers, "learn to take whatever's given, whether it's good for 'em or not. You walked through trouble holding your boy and didn't fall apart. That's worth something to me." Clara looked away toward the barn, the wooden boards silvered by years of wind. She didn't trust easy, and trust was the one thing she couldn't afford to get wrong again. Behind her, Eli's laughter carried from the yard, where he chased a stray feather caught in the wind. She turned toward the sound, her jaw tight, her heart heavier than she wanted to admit. It would be weeks before she realized that this, Caleb's quiet steadiness, his refusal to take what wasn't offered, was the beginning of a life she hadn't dared imagine. A month earlier, the wind had carried the smell of gun oil, damp leather, and pine down the ridge when Clara Weston stepped off the rutted road and into Pine Ridge Crossing. Her boots were worn thin, one lace snapped clean through, and her arms ached from holding Eli against her side. The boy's head rested under her chin, his breath shallow from the miles. She'd left the wagon 2 hours before, when the man driving it made clear what payment he expected for their passage west. She'd rather face the prairie on foot than his hands again. The town was quiet under the fading gold of evening. Smoke curled from the stovepipe of the small general store. A church bell tolled once, its note carrying across the hard-packed street. Clara's eyes swept the row of false front buildings, searching for any place with a roof and a door. That's when she saw the light spilling from the open barn doors at the far end of the street. Inside, a tall man was brushing down a roan mare, his shirt clinging to his shoulders with sweat. He glanced up as she crossed the threshold, but his gaze didn't linger where she feared it might. "I'm not looking for trouble," she said, voice dry from thirst. "You look like you already found it," he answered, setting aside the brush. "Come in before you fall down." She hesitated, pride holding her spine straight even as her knees weavered. The man didn't move toward her. Instead, he pulled a folded blanket from a hay bale and laid it out near a low wall. "Set him down here," he said. "I'll get water." Clara eased Eli onto the blanket, the boy curling up without a word. She stayed close, watching as the man poured water from a bucket into a tin cup and handed it to her. "Name's Caleb Rowan," he said. "Clara Weston," she replied, sipping slow to keep her hands from shaking. She nodded toward Eli. "That's my son." Caleb crouched beside the boy for a moment, listening to his breathing. "You run from someone?" "I left someone," she said, her voice clipped. He studied her face, the split lip, the dark bruise along her jaw, the stubborn set of her chin. "That someone gonna come looking?" "I hope he does." Caleb's mouth tightened just a fraction. "You got somewhere to go?" "No, but I can work. I'm not begging." "Didn't say you were," he answered. "You want to stay the night? You stay. You and the boy." It was the first kindness in weeks that hadn't asked for something in return. And that, somehow, felt heavier to carry than the cold. If you found this helpful, a quick like really helps us keep creating. By the second week of November, the air in Pine Ridge Crossing had turned thin and sharp. The mornings carried a skin of frost over every water trough and rail post, and even the horse's breath came in plumes. Clara Weston pulled her shawl tighter as she crossed the yard behind the livery, a bucket sweeting in each hand. Her legs still ached from the miles she'd walked to get here, but the ache was less sharp now, dulled by the rhythm of work. She started with the lighter chores, sweeping the aisle, brushing the calmer horses, and left the heavy lifting to Caleb. Over time, he let her do more, hauling hay, topping the water barrels, patching worn lead ropes. She never asked him for anything, and he never made her. Still, she found extra firewood stacked by her corner in the tack room one morning, a clean pail of hot water beside it. No note, no mention at breakfast. She only saw the faint sawdust on Caleb's coat when he came in from the yard. The town had taken notice of her, though in Pine Ridge that didn't mean questions. Folks here watched and weighed before they spoke. Sheriff Thompson, gray hair under a battered hat, tipped his head when they passed in the street, a gesture that said he'd marked her presence without judgment. Eli seemed to fit more easily. He trailed after her during chores, clutching a length of twine or a stick, sometimes sitting in a patch of sun with the stray cat that had claimed the barn. His cough from the first week had eased, replaced with the easy laughter of a boy who'd found enough to eat. It was the pastor's wife who bridged the first real gap. She was a small woman named Mrs. Ellsworth, with a neat bun and a voice that carried in the churchyard. She stopped by the barn one crisp afternoon with a basket of bread and an invitation. "Sunday school," she said, eyes warm but assessing. "We've a few little ones now, miners' families, a ranch hand's daughter. He's welcome." Clara's first instinct was to refuse. She didn't want Eli set apart, whispered about. But the way Mrs. Ellsworth's gaze lingered on the boy's thin frame told her it wasn't just piety speaking, it was care. "We'll come," Clara said, her voice careful. That Sunday, she followed Eli into the chapel's side room, its pine floors scrubbed smooth, the windows clouded with frost. She stayed at the back, helping set up the benches, while Eli joined the other children. Her hands knew the work without thinking, arranging space, lining up chairs, skills that had come from the years she'd spent in a mercantile in Missouri. She hadn't thought about that place in a long time, but the habit of order, of making a room ready for people, felt like slipping into a coat she hadn't worn in years. Caleb didn't come inside. She saw him through the window, leaning against the fence, the brim of his hat shadowing his eyes as he watched the yard. He wasn't watching her. He was watching Eli. When they left the church, snowflakes the size of corn husk threads had begun to fall, twisting in the wind. Caleb met them halfway down the walk, his hands in his coat pockets. "Town's saying the snow'll stick this time," he remarked. "Winter's here." Clara glanced at the street. Already folks were boarding up side windows, laying in coal, wrapping burlap around the water barrels. She had seen winters in Missouri, but she knew Wyoming's were longer, harder. She tightened her grip on Eli's hand. "Then we'd better be ready." Caleb gave a short nod, as if they'd just agreed to something more than weather. 2 days later, the stage rolled in from the south, its wheels thick with frozen mud. Clara was stacking kindling in the corner of the livery when she heard the driver's voice calling for Caleb. There was a rough edge to it that made her pause. The driver, a broad man in a patch duster, leaned against the barn door. "News from Willow Creek," he said, low enough to keep it from carrying. "Smallpox hit hard. Half the town's shut in. Doctor says it's moving quick." Caleb's expression didn't change, but something in his shoulders shifted. "Any talk of it spreading?" "They're keeping travelers there if they've been exposed, but—" The driver glanced toward the main street. "The stage line can't promise it won't reach here." Clara stayed where she was, her hands tightening around the bundle of sticks. She'd seen sickness before, but never the kind that swept through a place like fire through dry grass. When the driver left, Caleb turned to her. "You ever see smallpox?" She shook her head. "My brother died of it," he said, as simply as if he'd named the weather. "Cheyenne, 77. We were working cattle. He took sick on a Wednesday, buried him by Sunday." Clara set the kindling down slowly. "I'm sorry." "Wasn't anything to be done," he replied. "That's the part that stays with you." For a moment, neither spoke. Outside, the stage rattled off toward the next stop, the sound fading into the wind. That night, Clara found herself watching Caleb from across the small table in the tack room as Eli ate. The lantern light caught the hard line of his jaw, the steady set of his eyes. He carried his grief like he carried everything, quietly, without asking anyone else to bear the weight. After supper, Eli sat on the blanket with the mercantile ledger open across his knees. The ink was faded, the columns neat and narrow. Clara knelt beside him, guiding his finger under the looping letters. "That one's B," she said, her voice soft, "like bread." Eli mouthed the sound, his brow furrowed in concentration. He had his father's eyes, though Clara hated to admit it, even in her own head. But the stubborn curve of his mouth, that was hers. When he finally traced the letter without stumbling, she smiled. "Good, again." Caleb was leaning in the doorway watching them. "Ledger from the store?" he asked. "Back in Missouri," she said, not looking up. "Owner's wife taught me to keep the books. Said a woman who can read her own receipts won't get cheated." "That's a fact," Caleb replied. She heard the shift of his boots on the threshold, but didn't turn. If she looked at him now, with Eli's small hand gripping hers, she wasn't sure what he might see in her face. The wind rose outside, rattling the loose tin on the barn roof. Somewhere down the street, a door slammed. The world beyond Pine Ridge felt closer tonight. Disease in the next town, cold settling in the bones of the land, and a man standing in her doorway who seemed to know exactly how much to say and no more. Clara closed the ledger, smoothing the worn cover. "Bedtime," she told Eli. The boy crawled under the quilt. Caleb reached over and pulled the lantern wick low. "Cold snap comin'," he said. "Best keep him warm." Clara nodded, tucking the quilt tighter around her son. "We will." And for reasons she couldn't name, she found herself thinking not just of the cold, but of the way his voice had softened when he'd said, "we." Sheriff Thompson found her outside the mercantile, a sack of flour balanced on her hip. The morning sun had a pale edge to it, the kind that meant snow before the day was out. He touched the brim of his hat. "Mrs. Weston," he said, low and even, "I don't make a habit of carryin' tales, but you should know. If the man you're running from comes through Pine Ridge, we'll know before he reaches Main Street." Clara held his gaze. "And if he does?" The sheriff's eyes narrowed just slightly. "Then he'll find this town less welcoming than he expects." She nodded once, grateful and unsettled all at once. As he walked away, she realized she hadn't given him any description. And yet somehow he already knew enough. Pine Ridge had a way of seeing without asking. By midday, the clouds had thickened over the ridge, pressing low and gray. Caleb was in the corral, driving nails into a warped fence rail when she came back from town. "That storm's rolling faster than I thought," he said, straightening. "This fence needs shoring before the wind takes it down." "I can help," she said. He hesitated, then handed her a hammer. They worked in rhythm, the sound of metal on wood carrying across the yard. Caleb's gloves were worn through at the fingertips, his breath steady as he lifted each rail. Clara set nails, her arms straining against the cold, stiff boards. Neither spoke much. It wasn't the kind of silence that pressed. It was the kind that fit, like two pieces cut from the same cloth. By the time they finished, the first flakes had begun to fall, dry, fine, and fast. The wind sharpened, tugging at her shawl. "You'd best take Eli into the tack room tonight," Caleb said as they crossed back toward the barn. "Warmer in there than your corner." "I don't want to owe you more than I already do," she replied. His jaw tightened, but his voice stayed level. "It's not a debt. It's sense. The ground's gonna freeze hard by mornin'." In the barn, Eli was crouched by the stray cat, his mittened hands holding out a bit of twine. He looked up as they came in, eyes bright. "Storm's startin'," Caleb told him. "Your mama says you're movin' inside tonight." Eli nodded, unbothered, already gathering the few things they had: a folded quilt, the ledger, a small tin cup. That night, the three of them shared the small space at the back of the barn. The stove ticked softly, casting a low orange glow on the plank walls. Eli fell asleep quickly, his breathing even. Clara sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee Caleb had set there without a word. Outside, the wind rose, rattling the eaves. "You always prepare like this?" she asked. "Every winter," he said. "I've seen what happens to folks who wait until they're cold to make ready." She studied the lines in his face, the way the firelight caught the faint scar along his brow. There was no boast in his tone, no need to prove anything, just a man who'd learned his lessons the hard way and kept them. When the gusts hit hardest, shaking the barn doors on their hinges, Caleb stood, checked the latch, then came back to sit across from her. "Storm won't last," he said. Clara glanced toward the cot where Eli slept, the quilt pulled high to his chin. "Let's hope not." But she noticed for the first time that she believed him. The storm broke overnight, leaving the world under a clean white sheet. By Sunday, the sky had turned a brittle blue, and the snow crunched sharp underfoot. Clara followed Eli down the shoveled path to the chapel, her breath clouding in the air. The building was small, built from pine boards milled up in the hills, its steeple simple and unpainted. Inside, the air smelt faintly of beeswax and wood smoke. Families were shedding coats and stomping boots dry along the back wall. Caleb was already there, hat in hand, standing near the last row. He nodded when he saw her, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, then stepped aside so she could pass. Eli slid into a bench between her and a ranch hand's daughter. His eyes went wide at the sound of the organ, the notes quavering but steady. Clara kept her gaze on the hymnal, mouthing the words she remembered from years back. When the congregation rose for prayer, she glanced toward the rear. Caleb stood with his head bowed, hands clasped loosely before him. His stillness was different from the others, less ritual, more like a man holding a private conversation he didn't intend to share. After the service, people lingered in the yard, greeting neighbors, brushing snow from sleeves. Mrs. Ellsworth, the pastor's wife, made her way through the small crowd to where Clara stood with Eli. "You've a steady boy there," she said, smiling down at him. "Listens well, doesn't fidget. That's rare." Clara smoothed Eli's hair. "He minds when he wants to." Mrs. Ellsworth chuckled. "You ever thought of teaching? The mining camp has brought in half a dozen families with children. No one's steady to take them on." Clara's fingers tightened around Eli's shoulder. "I'm not sure I'm the sort they'd want." "Nonsense," Mrs. Ellsworth replied. "What matters is patience and a good hand with letters. I've seen you with your boy. You've both." Caleb joined them then, his coat collar dusted with snow. "She's right," he said, glancing at Clara. They'll see you for who you are now." Clara's eyes narrowed slightly. "You think they'll forget what they think they know?" "No," he said, "but they might learn something different." Mrs. Ellsworth excused herself to speak with another family, leaving Clara and Caleb alone by the chapel steps. The wind had picked up again, pulling at the loose strands of Clara's hair. "I don't need anyone's pity," she said. "You won't get it," Caleb answered, "not from the ones who matter." They walked back toward the livery in silence, Eli skipping ahead to kick at snowbanks. The streets were busy with folks hauling firewood and coal, preparing for the next cold snap. Inside the barn, Clara hung her shawl on the hook by the door. Caleb moved toward the feed bins, measuring grain for the afternoon. "Why would you put yourself forward for me like that?" she asked, suddenly. He didn't look up. "Because you're worth more than the corner you've been living in." The words caught her off guard. She busied herself with the bridle hanging near the stall, running her thumb over the worn leather. "I'll think about it," she said at last. "That's all I'm asking," he replied. Outside, Eli's laughter carried in from the yard, mingling with the clatter of a wagon passing on the street. The sound lingered in the quiet space between them, like a promise neither one had yet named. By mid-December, the days felt no longer than a breath. The sun slid behind the ridge by mid-afternoon, leaving Pine Ridge wrapped in a blue-gray chill. Frost rimmed every window, and even the air inside the barn held a bite. Clara kept busy because idle hands made her restless. She mended harness straps in the mornings, kept the tack room swept, and boiled water over the stove to steam the air for Eli's lungs. The boy had grown a shade sturdier since they'd arrived, his cheeks less hollow. But winter had a way of testing every gain. One evening, Caleb came in from the yard with something cupped in his palm. He set it on the table between them, a small brooch carved from pale wood, its petals rounded and layered into the shape of a sunflower. Clara looked from it to him. "What's this for?" "Because you've never been given something without a price," he said. Her throat tightened. "And what's the price here?" "There isn't one," he replied. "Not now, not later." She picked it up, feeling the fine lines under her thumb. The sunflower was smooth, each petal curved just enough to catch the light from the stove. She fastened it to the collar of her dress without another word. That night, the wind carried voices down the street, men talking outside the saloon. Most conversations blurred into background noise, but this one made her still. A voice she didn't know, asking after a woman traveling with a boy. Caleb noticed her glance toward the door. "Stay here," he said, already pulling on his coat. Through the crack in the barn door, she saw him cross the street, his stride easy, unhurried. Sheriff Thompson was already there, speaking low with the stranger, a drifter in a frayed bowler hat, dust on his coat like he'd been riding hard. Caleb's figure slid in beside the sheriff, a silent wall between the man and the street behind him. The talk didn't last long. The drifter moved on, swallowed by the night. Caleb returned without explanation, stamping the snow from his boots. "Was he asking about me?" Clara asked. "About a woman and a boy," Caleb said. "But not with enough detail to find you unless we tell him more." "You didn't?" He shook his head. "Sheriff won't either." She let out a slow breath, though the tension stayed coiled under her ribs. "He could come back." "Then we'll be ready." It was the we again, the quiet claim that still unsettled her, not because she doubted him, but because she didn't know what to do with it. Caleb sat down across from her, elbows resting on the table. "There's something else I haven't told you. I've got 80 acres west of the ridge, homestead land. Filed on it before I came here. Has a creek running through, some good cottonwoods. Deadline's coming to build before spring or I lose it." Clara traced the edge of the brooch at her collar. "Why tell me?" Because I don't want to build it alone." She looked at him for a long moment, the weight of his words settling between them like a fresh drift of snow. Quiet, but impossible to ignore. The snow had settled deep along the ridge, softening the lines of rock and scrub into long white sweeps. Caleb hitched the bay mare to the small sleigh before first light, the air so cold each breath burned the lungs. Clara stood by the barn with Eli bundled in her shawl, his cheeks already pink from the morning air. "Where are we going?" she asked, as Caleb tied down a small crate in the back. "To see something worth the cold," he said. The mare's hooves crunched over the packed road, the sleigh runners whispering through the snow. The town fell away behind them, replaced by the slow rise of the hills and the sound of the wind moving through cottonwoods. When they crested the last ridge, Caleb drew the mare to a stop. Before them stretched a broad valley, the snow broken only by the dark line of a creek winding toward a stand of trees. The water ran under a skin of ice, the current visible where it broke through in narrow ribbons. "This is it," he said. 80 acres. Creek for water, good ground once the thaw comes. If I put a cabin here before April, it's mine to keep." Clara stepped down into the snow, Eli following close, his small boots sinking deep. She turned slowly, taking in the sweep of land, the way the ridge sheltered it from the worst of the wind. "It's quiet," she said. "It can be more than that," Caleb replied. "A place that stays." She looked at him then, the cold biting at her eyes until they watered. "I don't know how to stand in something like this without bracing for the catch." "There's no catch," he said. "There always is." Her voice was low but steady. "I've learned not to take what I can't pay for." He stepped closer, snow crunching under his boots. "There's no ledger here, Clara, no debt waiting in the dark. You've been keeping score your whole life. I'm telling you, you don't have to with me." Eli had wandered toward the creek's edge, crouching to watch the water slide under the ice. Clara's gaze followed him, the tightness in her chest mingling with something softer she couldn't name. "When the thaw comes," Caleb said quietly, "we could start. Cabin first, then a garden. Enough space for him to run without looking over his shoulder." She didn't answer right away. The land lay open before her, untouched but waiting. She felt the weight of her past pressing against the possibility in front of her, both pulling in opposite directions. Finally, she nodded once. "Show me where you'd put the door." Caleb smiled, not wide, just enough to crease the lines at the corners of his eyes. He turned and pointed toward the cottonwoods. "There, so you see the sun when it rises." And for the first time in years, Clara realized she wanted to watch something begin. If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me on this journey. The wind came without warning, first a low moan in the cottonwoods, then a shrill howl that bent them toward the ridge. By the time the sun dipped behind the western bluff, snow was driving sideways across Pine Ridge Crossing. Men were shouting over the gusts, tying shutters, hammering loose boards back into place before the storm tore them free. Caleb came up from the barn with his hat pulled low, coat collar turned against the wind. He spotted Clara at the pump, trying to fill a bucket before the ice seized it. Eli clung to her skirt, his small face tight with the sting of flying snow. "You can't stay out here," Caleb said, taking the bucket from her. She opened her mouth to argue, but the wind slammed the word back down her throat. He set the bucket aside, took her elbow, and nodded toward the church where lantern light flickered against frosted windows. Inside, the air was warmer, thick with the scent of pine pitch from the big stove. A half-dozen townsfolk had gathered, Mrs. Hensley from the mercantile, the pastor's wife with her knitting, 2 ranch hands stamping the snow from their boots. The sheriff stood by the door, coat open, scanning the street each time it blew open on its hinges. Caleb guided Clara and Eli toward the back pew, close to the stove. He unwrapped the scarf from around Eli's neck, tucking the boy beneath his spare coat. "Stay here," he said, his voice low but certain. "You're safe." Eli pressed closer to his mother, eyes wide at the hiss of wind rattling the shutters. Clara sat stiff for a long moment, her hands folded so tight her knuckles whitened. She'd spent too many nights in strange rooms, listening for footsteps that meant trouble. This one was different. Steady voices, the pastor's calm tone as he read a psalm, Mrs. Hensley passing cups of tea down the pew. Caleb didn't hover. He checked the stove, spoke with the sheriff, then returned to sit at the aisle end like a sentry. Once, when the church doors blew open again and the sheriff stepped out into the snow, Caleb's eyes followed him until the door shut. Then his gaze shifted back to her, and for a moment neither of them looked away. The wind roared on, shaking the roof beams, but the pew beneath her stayed solid. Clara let out a slow breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The storm could have the ridge and the open country. It wasn't getting in here, not tonight. The wind did not ease through the night. Snow struck the windows in hard bursts, as if the whole prairie were trying to get inside. The stove's fire held steady, though, throwing a low orange light across the pews. Most of the townsfolk had settled into a weary silence, some dozing with hats pulled low, others murmuring quietly. Eli had fallen asleep against Clara's side, his small hand curled in her skirt. She smoothed his hair back, her fingers trembling. Caleb sat a few feet away, his shoulder resting against the wall, watching the door the way a trail scout watches a ridgeline. Every so often he'd glance her way, never pressing, just making sure she was still steady. When the pastor's wife moved to check on another family, the space between them felt quieter, almost private despite the storm. Clara kept her voice low. "I was married once," she said. Caleb didn't shift, didn't make a sound, but his eyes found hers. "He drank," she went on. "Not every day. Sometimes he'd go weeks without. And then he wouldn't stop." The wind outside gusted hard enough to rattle the lantern on the wall. "When Eli was little," she said, "I saw him watching the way his father talked when he'd had too much. Loud, mean, like he thought being a man was all about taking space and making others small." She swallowed hard, her gaze fixed on the stove. "I left before he could learn that lesson for good." Caleb didn't speak. He didn't tell her she'd done right. She already knew that. He didn't ask questions about the man's name or where he might be. He simply stayed, his presence quiet but unshaken. Clara let the words sit between them like embers that no one stirred. It had been years since she'd told anyone. The truth felt raw in her mouth, but not poisoned. "I keep thinking," she said, "if I don't say it out loud, it'll fade. But it doesn't. It just waits." Caleb's voice was low, steady. "Now it's not just waiting, it's gone somewhere." For a moment she thought he meant himself, that he'd take it on, and maybe, in a way, he had. The storm roared again, but she no longer felt like she was listening for footsteps. She leaned back against the pew, Eli's breath warm against her side, and let herself be still. By morning, the wind was gone. The air outside the church lay heavy and still, muffled under a blanket of snow so deep it swallowed half the hitching posts. Roof lines sagged beneath drifts, and the streets were carved into narrow paths by the first few brave shovels. Every sound was softened, hammer taps, voices calling from one porch to another, all wrapped in the hush of a world reset. Clara stepped out into it with Eli's small hand tucked in hers. The cold caught her lungs sharp, but she drew it in anyway. The storm had scoured the sky to a pure, aching blue, and sunlight spilled off the ridge in sheets of gold. For a moment she stood still on the church steps, her boots crunching in the snow. Out here, everything felt new. As if the night before had been a threshold she didn't know she was crossing until she was on the other side. Caleb came around from the alley, shovel in hand, snow clinging to his coat. "Roads'll take days to clear," he said. "Good thing the town's got nowhere to be." His breath made clouds in the sharp air. She smiled faintly. "I can think of worse places to be stuck." He studied her for a beat longer than comfort allowed, then nodded toward the church door where the pastor stood stamping his boots. "Council'll be meeting after noon prayer. I told him I'd be speaking to them." Clara's brow knit. Speaking to them? About what? Caleb planted the shovel in the snow, leaning on the handle. "About letting you teach here, in the church." The words landed heavy, not because they were unwelcome, but because they brushed a corner of her she'd kept walled off. Caleb, I don't." She shook her head, eyes darting to where Eli was scooping snow into a pile with his mittened hands. "There are folks here who'd think they know all they need to about me. That's enough to stop a thing before it starts." "They think they know," Caleb said, his voice even. "But I've watched you work. Watched you keep that boy safe. Watched you treat people right, whether they deserved it or not. That's what they'll see if you let 'em." The sun caught on the frost in his hair, turning it pale as the drifts around them. Clara looked out at the street, neighbors clearing paths, handing each other tools, building something together from the damage the night had left. "All right," she said quietly. "Let's see if they will." The council met in the back room of the church, a space that smelled faintly of lamp oil, hymn books, and the cedar chest where the communion linens were kept. A pot-belly stove thumped with heat in the corner, but the air still carried a chill from the door's constant opening as members filed in. Caleb stood near the back, arms folded, boots planted wide. He didn't hover close to Clara, but she could feel the anchor of him there. The councilmen, a half-circle of weathered faces, sat behind a narrow table. Most wore their Sunday coats, the brass buttons dulled with age. The pastor sat in the center, spectacles balanced low on his nose. To his right, the pastor's wife kept her hands folded neatly in her lap. "We're here about the matter of schooling the children from the mining families," the pastor began. "Brother Caleb tells me Mrs. Clara Ward has the skills and willingness to take on the role." One of the older men, Mr. Davies, leaned forward, his jaw tight. "We've no quarrel with your intentions, ma'am, but folks don't always settle well with newcomers instructing their young, especially when we don't know the whole of their background." The words were polite, but the weight behind them wasn't. Clara kept her hands still in her lap, even as her pulse climbed. The pastor's wife spoke before Clara could. "I know her background," she said, her voice calm but carrying. "I know she's worked from sun up to sundown every day she's been here. I know she's fed her boy before herself. And I know she's the reason my benches were set straight last week before the hymnals even arrived." A faint rustle of murmurs moved through the room. Caleb's voice joined in from the back. "If you're looking for someone the children can look up to, I'd start with the person who's already teaching one how to read at the corner table in the livery every afternoon." All eyes shifted to Clara. She rose slowly, not to make a speech, but because she couldn't stay seated if she wanted her words to hold. "I can teach letters and numbers," she said, "but more than that, I can teach them what it means to keep going when the easy thing is to quit. If you think that's worth something, then I'll give what I have." Silence hung a moment. Then the pastor's wife nodded once to her husband. The pastor cleared his throat. "By council vote, the position is yours, beginning this spring." Clara sat again, her breath leaving in a slow, steady stream. Caleb's eyes met hers from across the room, and though he didn't smile, there was a quiet triumph there. The council meeting broke before noon, and by the time they stepped outside, the sun was bright enough to turn the snowfields into a dazzling white glare. Clara and Caleb walked side by side down the packed street, Eli running ahead to kick at drifts.
"You didn't have to speak for me in there," she said. "I didn't," Caleb replied. "I spoke for the children who'll have you teaching them." They reached the livery, where the air smelled of hay and warm leather. Caleb ducked inside first, gesturing for her to follow.
"Got something I've been meaning to show you," he said. From a small chest near his bunk, he pulled a folded packet wrapped in oilcloth. The leather ties were worn smooth from years of handling. He set it in her hands. "Go on." She untied it slowly, revealing a sheet of paper faded to sepia. Her eyes scanned the careful script, and her brow creased. "This is a deed." 80 acres, Caleb said, west of the ridge, down where the cottonwoods run along the creek. Filed on it before I came here under the Homestead Act. Meant to build a place, but, he shrugged, never had reason to. Her fingers tightened on the paper. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because I want that land to be ours. A house, a garden, a place Eli can run without worrying what's coming over the next hill." He met her gaze without flinching. "I want to marry you, Clara, not because you need it, because I do." The words hit harder than she expected, not because she doubted them, but because of how steady they were, how little they asked in return. She glanced toward the barn doors, where sunlight spilled in golden across the straw. "You know my past," she said quietly. "You know there are folks who'll never see me as more than what I was." Caleb stepped closer, his voice even. "I know who you are now, and I know I'd rather build with you than anyone I've ever met." She looked down at the deed again, at the sweep of ink and the weight of what it promised. Then she folded it carefully and set it back in his hands. "I want that land," she said, "and I want the house, and—" her voice steadied, "I want you." Caleb didn't smile wide, just that small shift at the corner of his mouth, the one that told her the words meant more than anything she could have handed him. Spring came late to Pine Ridge Crossing that year, but when it arrived, it broke open all at once. Cottonwood buds swelling overnight, the creek running fast with snowmelt, and the air rich with the smell of thawed earth. They married under the cottonwoods behind the chapel, where the ground was soft enough to take a spade, but still cool beneath the grass. The creek bent gently around the grove, its water flashing in the sun. Clara wore a dress sewn from flour sacks, every panel washed and pressed until the faint brand marks looked like pale patterns. A narrow strip of lace, traded for with eggs, edged the sleeves. Her hair was pulled back, but a few strands lifted in the breeze. Caleb wore his best shirt, the cuffs patched neat, and boots polished with bear fat until the leather shone dark. He stood with his shoulders square but easy, as if the choice to be there wasn't a decision at all, but the only road he'd ever meant to take. Eli stood between them, holding a ring Caleb had carved from bone and set with a shard of agate found along the ridge. His eyes darted between their faces, the solemnity of the moment only half hiding his excitement. The pastor kept the words simple. "Do you come together by choice and with the intent to keep to one another through all seasons?" "I do," Caleb said. "I do," Clara answered, her voice clear and steady. When the rings were exchanged, there was no murmur from the gathered crowd, no sharp glances or whispering about where she'd come from. The town had seen her split wood in the cold, scrub benches before service, and teach a boy his letters at a rough-hewn table. They'd made up their minds long before this day. After the vows, the pastor's wife pressed a hand to Clara's shoulder. "You've given this town more than it gave you at first. That's worth more than talk." There was bread and stew afterward in the church hall, children weaving between the benches while the adults shared quiet congratulations. Caleb kept close, not hovering, but always within reach, and Clara found herself at ease in a way she hadn't believed possible when she first stepped into his barn. When the day wound down and the last of the dishes were stacked, Caleb took her hand as they stepped outside. The cottonwoods whispered overhead, their new leaves trembling in the evening breeze.
"This is where we start," he said. And for once, she didn't think about the past or the distance she'd traveled. She thought only of the land waiting west of the ridge and the life they were about to build there. If you like this video, please comment number 9. If you don't like it, please comment number 0. By midsummer, the heat lay over Pine Ridge Crossing like a soft, steady blanket. The snows had long since melted from the ridge, and the wildflowers spread across the meadow in waves of yellow and violet. In the small chapel-turned-schoolhouse, the sound of chalk against slate mixed with the restless shuffling of boots. Clara stood at the front of the room, 8 children seated before her. Some were from mining families, others from small ranches scattered along the valley. Eli sat in the front row, his posture nearly straight, his fingers perpetually ink-stained from the primer he guarded like treasure. He grinned every time he answered a question correctly. And though she tried not to play favorites, Clara's heart swelled each time she saw his hand shoot into the air. Outside the chapel, Caleb was working with 2 neighbors, Mr. Davies and young Aaron Hill, hauling timber out to the West Ridge. The frame of their new house was already up, the fresh-cut boards pale and clean against the deep green of summer grass. Caleb had refused to build it alone, insisting that a home was something better made with many hands. Clara split her days between teaching in the mornings and tending the beginnings of a garden in the afternoons. She had marked out neat rows of beans, carrots, and onions, the earth rich and dark under her palms.
A pair of hens scratched nearby, drawn by the scent of turned soil. One afternoon, Eli came tearing down the hill from the chapel with a bundle of sticks under one arm and an old hat bobbing on his head. "Mama, I'm making a scarecrow," he shouted before dropping to his knees beside the garden plot. Together, they tied the sticks with twine and dressed the frame in one of Caleb's worn shirts. The scarecrow stood lopsided, grinning at the field with a button-eyed face Clara stitched from a scrap of cloth. The rhythm of their days settled into something sturdy and sure. In the evenings, they ate at the table Caleb had built, the air warm with the smell of stew or fresh bread. Neighbors often stopped by to lend tools or share a meal, and it was no longer unusual for laughter to carry across the yard well past sunset. Every so often, Clara would catch sight of the ridge from the porch, the cottonwoods swaying above the creek where they had wed. The land beyond was theirs now, signed, sealed, and ready for whatever came next. One Sunday afternoon, Caleb paused from hammering to watch her gather a basket of beans. He leaned on the post, sweat darkening his shirt, and said simply, "It's starting to look like it's always been here." She glanced up at the house frame, the garden rows, the laundry line with Eli's shirts fluttering in the breeze. Maybe it was just waiting for us. Caleb didn't answer right away, but his smile, small and sure, was enough. By August, the roof was on, the walls stood solid, and the windows caught the late summer sun like pieces of polished amber. The community had turned out in quiet generosity. The pastor's wife donated curtains, Aaron Hill's mother sent over a quilt, and Mr. Davies, who had once doubted her place in town, carved a wooden bench for the porch. There were no speeches, no grand declarations, just the steady work of hands and the knowledge that the house was rising because people believed in the ones who would live there. For Clara, it was more than a building. It was proof, piece by piece, that she had stepped out of the shadow of running and into a place that welcomed her, not as someone to be pitied, but as someone worth standing beside. The day they moved in, the air was still warm from the last weeks of summer, but a faint edge of autumn rode the breeze. The house smelled of fresh-cut wood and linseed oil, the floorboards pale beneath their boots. Eli darted from room to room, his voice echoing off the bare walls. "This one's mine," he called from the small bedroom at the back, the one with a window facing the cottonwoods. Clara smiled, setting a folded quilt on the bed frame Caleb had built just his size. By sundown, their few belongings were unpacked. A kettle sat ready on the new stove, the garden vegetables rested in a basket by the door.
Outside, the ridge stood dark against a sky streaked with pink and gold. Clara stood in the doorway of the sleeping room, watching as Caleb leaned over Eli's bed. He pulled the quilt to the boy's chin, tucking it in just enough to keep out the night air. Eli's breathing slowed, his lashes dark against his cheek. Caleb stayed there a moment longer, as if committing the sight to memory. When he straightened, Clara was still watching him. The lamplight caught in her eyes. She stepped into the room, her voice low.
"This is what I never thought I'd have, a place that stays." Clay glanced around, taking in the walls, the bed, the quiet weight of safety. Then he looked back at her. "You built it." She shook her head. "We built it." They left the lamp burning low and stepped onto the porch. The boards were cool under her bare feet. Somewhere in the dark, a nightjar called, and the cottonwoods whispered softly in the breeze. For a long time, neither spoke. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was the kind that came when words were no longer needed. The town was quiet, the ridge steady, and for the first time in years, Clara felt no urge to listen for footsteps behind her. "You know," Caleb said finally, his tone almost amused, "when you came into that barn the first night, I figured you'd be gone by morning." She smiled faintly. "I figured the same." "And yet, here we are." "Here we are," she echoed, her gaze drifting toward the shadowed fields. They stayed on the porch until the stars thickened overhead, a wide silver scatter across the dark. Inside, the fire in the stove burned slow and steady, the warmth of it reaching into every corner of the house. Clara thought of the road that had brought her here, the dust, the cold, the empty promises, and of the people who had chosen not to ask, not to judge, but simply to help. She thought of Eli, sleeping without fear. She thought of Caleb, steady as the ridge, whose only bargain had been a place to stand side by side. "This is home," she said quietly, almost to herself. Caleb didn't answer in words. He simply reached over, his fingers brushing hers, and left his hand there. In the stillness, Clara understood something she hadn't been able to see before. Home wasn't the walls or the land, though those mattered. It was the absence of running. It was the presence of someone who stayed. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of the garden and the faint, damp smell of the creek. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the world went on. Trains ran, storms gathered. Men like the one she had fled still walked the earth. But here, on this patch of land, in this house they had built, there was peace. And for the first time, she believed it would last. Step into Western love stories. Tales where dust roads lead to tender hearts, and every sunset holds a promise. These are stories of grit, grace, and second chances, steering the soul like an old song you've always known. Ride with us and feel home again.